Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a place to cohere in dialogue, sometimes to play around with disco hearing. Disco hearing is kind of a dance move from the 70s. Disco hearing at the knife's edge of the moment around what matters most. And this is sessions called High Pitch. It's experimental session with some lovely people, Ria Baeck, Nora Bateson, Miriam Mason Martineau, Ece Anderson, and Schuyler Brown, and myself. Sky can't make it today, and Nora is here. Thanks so much, but I know that she has to duck out right at the hour. So, as usual, we're going to see this session with a question that I hope you find interesting, and we'll see where it takes us. The question is, what do you see as a possible better world in 20 years? And can you point us to steps you hope to see or are beginning to see today that can be taken to create that world? So this notion of what in the time frame, let's say the rest of my life, could we hope to see as a possible better world? And can we identify some of the trends that are around today, or what do you hope to see happening that will take us in that direction? Yeah, so thank you for considering the question.
I find myself sitting with the largeness of the question. I can literally feel it physically. I feel like you just like put the whole earth and everything upon it and the cosmos in front of us and ask this question. I was also thinking 20 years feels long and it feels very short. I feel a huge amount of worry and concern these days about the future. You know, that was very present to me as you asked the question too. I wake up at night and I fret and I pray. It seems to me that what really is needed now is it is a full meta systemic transformation. So, you know, I can look at one little area and the other, and they're all important and they're all good, but what feels most relevant is in a way looking at the entire system and having a view that's of the entirety, and looking at climate, ecology, economy, education, parenting, how we do governance, like, and that's where I feel the largeness. And then I can also come back to, there's also the change that needs to happen on the interior. It is where it begins within each of us, between just two people, every little interaction. So it's sort of both micro, macro, and how it all ties together. So maybe I'll just leave it at that for now, but I felt the largeness of your question.
Okay, I can go next. When I read the question, when Bonnie proposed it to us, I was like, my first reaction is, I don't have a clue. Like, how will the world look like in 20 years from now? So many things can happen in all kinds of directions. but I think that the people here, gathered here, we all have some kind of maybe intuition, inner knowing that it is changing and it needs to change. And I hear little examples of how we are all changing. Like, I remember Miriam just, I think last week, probably in an email, I don't remember, like, oh, we were chopping wood. And I heard Nora say at some point, like, oh, we started a garden. And I know how Bonnie lives with her horses and vegetables, and I know how I live. And the examples about how to go different with the children, and how we all try to have different conversations or a different tone in conversations, that are all parts of me that are like signposts in some kind of direction. But I think when, I don't know when, a couple of years ago or quite some years ago, my linear expectation that life would always go better and better and better, and that kind of collapsed at some point. And I think it was the crisis in Europe around the migrants coming in, and what that all started was like, it's not going like that, not at all. And I don't know, it feels like we need to go first under to come up with something new, novel. That's my first take on it.
We can't hear you, Nora.
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Great,
Okay.
thanks.
I was just saying, I can first really resonate with Miriam when you said this is just so big, and the meta and the micro and the all of it, and Ria also with, I have no idea. I think one thing that you just said, Ria, that really kind of strikes me is this idea of this trip to the future being a linear journey, and that it probably isn't, and that the way in which we are now responding to the past is forming paths into the future that is also folding back and forth. What we're learning from our children is teaching us about the past, and what we learned in the past is teaching us about the future. So there's a lot of complexity happening here. And the other thing about that complexity is that there's this historically, this is kind of an ironic thing to say, but historically we've had an idea of how to make a plan, and then how to proceed to produce that plan. And it's, when I look at what my plans were for myself 10 years ago and what actually happened, I'm so glad my plans didn't work out. And those plans, they more than didn't work out. They were sabotaged from, are countless different directions before they ever got started, but I didn't see that. So I started in a direction. And one thing is that I really cared about the thing I was starting with. I'm thinking when I first started making this film about my dad and how much that just changed my whole life. But I had no idea. I think I imagined that I was gonna, go on to be a movie maker and that I was gonna be in LA and I was gonna make biographies. And that's not what happened at all. And thank goodness. So I started this project and I started it and it just began to open me, and I found chambers of myself in my history, and I saw it in my children, and it created relationships with people and places, and I started to find myself doing having conversations and working with family therapists and ecologists and people working on the economy, and as this happened, I became more and more filled with this kind of fibering of being that kept producing more pathways to more relationships, and they formed more relationships. So I think the thing about the future that's so hard to imagine is the way in which there will be all these second, third, fourth, fifth order relational processes going on that and how they don't fit in the plan. And so the notion of how to make the future, what to do to make the future better, I guess for me, it just comes down to being in the minute particulars, like Blake said, of right now with the greatest amount of integrity and care to not just to the moment, but to what the moment might lead to. And that's it's a different thing. It's not just that I care if my kids get the dishes done. It's that they need to get the dishes done with their dignity intact, so that tomorrow when they go to school, they're not angry. Because that makes a difference how they're in class with their classmates. Right? So it's that kind of a thing. Yeah, I'll start there.
There's something you said there, Nora, about being present to the moment with everything we have that is good, that is true, that is beautiful, and that really brings dignity to the fore, and also listening to where it leads. That then led me to feeling that we can also, I feel like we can listen to the whispers of the future. So rather than think it's something that we are just going to get to somehow, and we don't know which one, and it can be very nonlinear, and it most likely will be. Can we also, I mean, maybe I'll put this as a question, can we also listen to what the future might be calling forth from the present with the past, and actually include the future as a conversation partner in this conversation?
I can pick it up from there. As when I was writing my book on collective presencing, I had this for a longest time in one of the chapters. It was the relationship with the future. And when I was contemplating that, I couldn't get rid of the linear thinking that was behind it when I named it future. That I was still stuck in that linear line from past to present to future. And So I tried to work on that, and I came up with what is our relationship with potential, and brings us probably back, or brings us to Bonnitta's potential states. I think you call it, Bonnie. Like, there's so much potential in our own response to, let's say, the child needing to do the dishes, and or anything actually. And how can we tap that potential here and now, like in these minor actions, whatever we are doing? And at least I have a sense. I first came across that in sessions with clients and doing body work. And sometimes I could sense what their next body move would be. Even they didn't know, probably here, but because it's probably something about, or we could sense where wholeness wants to go, maybe, I don't know. And then there's maybe so many ugly things that could happen also. I don't know, but that's what I'm passionate about. Like, can we sense the potential and move with that to at least one step, kind of. Yeah, leave it with that.
So,
go
ahead.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead, Bonnitta, go ahead.
No, I came up with the question a couple of days ago, and then I started struggling with it myself, which was interesting. So it generated more reflection than answers. But one of the things that I noticed was how, so I think we all share this reluctance of not to plan or project out into the future. But I noticed how much easier that is to project negative things out into the future, and how careful and wise we are not to project positive things. So I noticed how the negative things, like I had this vision of like this trajectory of AI and artificial intelligence and stuff that would be the background for my one or two positive things that I could think of over the next 20 years. And just noticing how willing my mind is to project negative futures, and how careful and cautious, and smart I am not to project positive futures. So that was very curious to me. And so in that process, what I realized was a couple of things. Like, so I asked myself the question, am I less happy? Like this, of course, the question is got a hook onto it, because I asked for a better possible world, right? And I had to, the reason why I was careful to language it that way was because I noticed I could think of lots of bad scenarios. And so I asked myself, am I better off today than I was 20 years ago? And then the question of better was very interesting to me, because the facts of my life today, 20 years ago, the facts that I was attracted to that would have been better are the things I don't like about my life. And the fact that the things that I think are better about my life, 20 years ago, if that person was looking in the future, they'd be like, "Ew, that's not a better future." And so, like, the context, and maybe this is what you were going to say, Nora, before I jumped in. The context of what is better changes as things change. And so that was interesting experience that I had.
I think it's also after the last 8 months or so, a good idea, as Sam Wright said to me recently in a conversation we were having, to think about that we may not, we may not be the agents that are making the change. We may be in response to a lot of change. And so that brings a really different kind of notion to what it is that is happening. If you don't get to drive the change, if you don't get to manifest the plan, because there's things happening. I mean, maybe a few of us had plans for 2020. Well, those didn't work out. And they really completely didn't work out. And, for all kinds of really, loss of life, loss of employment, loss of all kinds of things. So it's more than just, groovy uncertainty. It was hard. It's been hard. So how the responding to that happens, and that's, on the one hand, that's your individual internal work, how you're going to respond to what is going on in life. And on the other hand, it's something we do in relationship. And I think that's the piece that I really am interested in working on, is what happens in relationship around responding to change. And when you look at what is happening around COVID as something to respond to together, one of the things that is happening is that people are really struggling with meeting that change in relationship. There's a lot of polarity out there. And it's almost like the illusions or the addictions to ways of living are held in the relationships, and the relationships have to break to get out of those illusions. And it's so painful to have those breakings. And at the same time, maybe it's possible to then get to new possibilities of being in different kinds of relationships that are maybe not so weighted down in the illusions of the past. Maybe. I'm hoping. And I find that hope and fear, they live together. Most of the time when I say I hope, what I'm also saying is I have a fear that this won't happen. And when I say I'm afraid this is going to happen, what I'm really saying is I hope that it doesn't. And so those two things are, I think, right there side by side in your question, Bonnitta.
So I want to give Ece a chance to respond, and then there's some ideas coming also in the chat that maybe we could can think about some of the ways that the participants are answering this question.
Thank you, Bonnie, for calling me in. I was not gonna jump because this question is really bringing up a lot in me. And I find myself somewhat dissociating with it. Having a 5.5-year-old and still being a young mother might have to do with it. A mother of a young child. And as you speak of the positive or negative projections, yeah, like the first time I read the question, I actually read it as, I didn't even see the positive wording in there. Like the moment I saw future, there's, already a cloud that sinks in. And I think my personal reaction, or the way I choose then to, it's not even a choice. The only way I seem to be able to then exist in this world where this is the case is to create as much resilience and sanity within myself, and to really dive into how to do that, right? And then I do realize I have this positive projection of where by necessity, where I see more of that happening in the world, more of us by necessity, finding our way to more sanity, more islands of sanity, like Margaret Whitley talks about it. And there's also, it's not all bleak. I also have a very strong sense of, and I'm not sure if I've heard you speak about it, kind of against this idea of evolution as a forward movement. I have a sense that evolution is a movement that is increasingly going towards more harmonious complexity. So do I call that better, or I do call that better, actually. And so then I have a sense that I am kind of a dot in that movement, and it's really not my doing that does anything. So when Nora, you talk about like, do we bring the change or do we respond? It's really in relationship to this movement that we're already in, inevitably. Like if I were to die tomorrow, the same trajectory is in play. If we were all to disappear, the same trajectory is in play. It's just that urge that is coming from the guts of the universe, if you will, is going to come through other people, So I have a sense that is bubbling around the globe, and is finding any crack it can to come through. And that does, from my observations, as a Turkish person, as a person who has lived in many places, to people who live in White Salmon, Washington, who are very liberal and consciousness savvy, if you will. It might not look like a thing, but I see it as a movement, like these islands that are, these communities that are forming. I actually observe it throughout the world. So I do hope there's the hope along with the fear, that is what's going to happen in a world of ever increasing challenge, but also increasing creativity and islands where we have figured out at least how to our own way of making it, whatever that might look like. I hope that made sense. Yeah.
I'm reminded of what we spoke about last week, which was choice. And, and in what Nora, you were talking about, how we respond, I feel like there is so much choice in there. There's so much potential alive. I love how you were mentioning, Bonnitta, that you think about the future and then the first thing is there's dismay or bleakness, and yet it could be other, right? And for it to be other, what does that actually demand of us in this moment? Like, how does the better future reach back to us? Or maybe if it's not linear, not back, but how does the future reach to us now, to the potential we have within ourselves as individuals, to the potential that lives in every relationship, and in the whole of humanity as a collective? And what choices can we make now to nudge ourselves to a preferred future? So when I think of that, I go to the kind of like trying to track, okay, well, what's, if I follow like a taproot, what's at the root of what feels so deeply dysfunctional? What is at the root of what feels is causing so much suffering and polarity and confusion. And can I shift that within myself? That feels like very relevant homework then. Can I shift that? Can I literally choose to show up with love as much as possible, day in, day out, in my immediate relationships, but also in my larger, longer arc choices and endeavors? And when I go to that route, I do get to the it feels like as long as we keep seeing ourselves as separate from each other, and as long as we, even in the most subtle ways, see ourselves as against one another, we're going to keep repeating the past as we have. Like we've refined, we have improved how to get along by being very separate. But I feel like where we need to go as far as a preferred future is to shift that part without losing individual sovereignty and uniqueness and the beautiful, authentic nature of each person, but to realize that underneath it all, we're undeniably connected. And we need each other. We actually need each other's perspectives. There's no way my lens can see the complexity of the whole thing. I need, and this is the beautiful thing about this conversation, it's like a beginning, and I know there's many of these beginnings, and I so appreciate what you're doing on the Stoa, Peter, because I feel like it is bringing so many lenses, and I feel like the only way we can make choices now, being informed by the potential that actually lives in us, is by having many perspectives come to the table and look together. And to do that, to actually undo this pernicious thing of me against you. Like that when I hear a perspective that jars me a little bit, that rather than putting my heels against it, that I actually lean in and get curious and say, tell me about this. Like, tell me how you see the world. Tell me what gift lies in this perspective, and then weave from then on. So yeah, and this is where I get more energized. Like because I can feel a lot of dismay, and then I'm like, I can't remember who said it, but something about the only way to predict the future is to create it. Like I do feel there's also an energy of boldness of now is the time more than ever to actually step into trying to get to the roots within ourselves of how we're contributing to a future continuing in the ways that we actually feel dismay about. And what do I need to do within myself and in my relationships to find other roots, to find ones that are much more like the way the soil actually is, where it is all connected.
One way that I like to describe that, Miriam, and it's this, I think, attention to the way in which the very subtle but pernicious messaging that is so deep around just constantly assessing the world around the question of what's in it for me. In what way do I get ahead by this? And that thing is just there. It's just everywhere. And it's a subtle thing to keep your eye out for, but I think it makes a really big difference because it's on those lines that so much is justified. And if this person's going to, get what they can get out of it, then, you better get what you can get out of it. And I remember this is a little bit cynical what I'm going to say right here, so I'm going to try to give it some goodness too. But this kind of idea that integrity right now is about being in the moment, and it's really about figuring out how to not necessarily do what you did last time or be coherent or predictable, but to be able to respond to the changing moments. And that means something very different than knowing right from wrong. Okay, so right from wrong, that thing got corrupted because it didn't turn out to be about what's right and what's wrong. It turned out to be about what you could get away with. And that again fell into that kind of what's in it for me, how do I get ahead in this? But these things are deep and they're lurking. And so I just wanted to say them out loud because for me, paying attention to where that creeps in is really important because sometimes I'm surprised where it comes in. And this the logic that ensues from that position, like you said, Miriam, is not the logic of we're in this together and my health is your health and my well-being is your well-being and the well-being of the biosphere, etc.
You know, I just had this strange thought, I think sparked by Nora. So I'm just going to share it with you because I've never thought of this way before, but it's almost like we have more future now than ever because in the 50s, you didn't have a lot of future. You just like, okay, you could see I was going to go to school. And, you know, it was all just a trajectory of the past. And maybe like for the first time in our lives, we actually have a future because the definition of a future is that it's like not there yet, right? So maybe that produces some kind of cultural anxiety. Maybe that's the challenge to what is it like to live with a future? And certainly years and years ago, it was mostly families reproduced the past, right? So I don't know, it was just a reframe that I thought was kind of interesting, somehow based upon how we got to this statement of Nora's, but yeah. Nora, there was a clarifying question in the chat. I don't know if too much I don't know if it's slipped, it's, you know, we've gone too far now, but you had talked about something about it's scary because sometimes you have to relationships have to be broken to go forward. Do you feel like you could, yeah, Nora, please say more about the breaking of relationships, people, ideas, and beliefs. Can you help us out with that?
Yeah, and I also want to say that that it's actually just sort of something that an idea that I'm just kind of experimenting with too. Just watching all these relationships and our assumptions about those relationships, assumptions of relationships between generations, assumptions of relationships um, between genders, between in different cultures, between different ways of being and religions, etc. But these assumptions are forming edges around who we perceive ourselves as being, and they really they really ossify, they really get hard, and it becomes very, very difficult to figure out where the culture ends and you begin, and where the history of this relationship with, say, authority, where what is it that is in me that is responding to this in this way and that way, that is wanting to be a good girl but also wanting to rebel. I mean, none of this is consistent or coherent. It's all in contradiction and paradox, these relationships. But so often I feel like we're carried along in the continued relationality of a lot of assumptions that may not be mine or yours, but somehow they're built in us. They're down in the deep down. So I mean, I guess I'm just looking in particular at a lot of the the vitriol that has come up in social media with people just bickering about everything, and that there's maybe there's a need for some kind of dissolving of the existing structures of the way that the relationships we're in now have become, because that's how they continue, right? Really what I'm looking at is what is continuance, and how do we think about the ways in which things are combining to produce a way to continue. And in looking at kind of the way the old system wants to keep going, and the ideas to create new system are often completely contaminated with ideas that are rooted and patterned in old system thinking, but they're inside the relationship. We can't do this project because it doesn't fit into the grant proposal. The language of this has to be able to be heard within this set of structures. We can't, there's so much you can't do because it isn't in the relationship. So it's that thing of noticing, and I was talking to our group last night about this, that, communication is not what is said or not said. Communication is what it's possible to say. And that's in those relationships. And maybe if the relationships are changing shape, it will be possible to say things that we haven't said before and be in ways we haven't been before. That's what I meant, sort of. But I recognize this is a kind of a germinating, embryonic kind of seedling thought. But it's there. And just maybe, who are we becoming? I think that if I were to look at where I was last November, this way that I'm living now would be very foreign to that person. And this, maybe we are foreigners to our own future.
Yeah, I think that's why I said I have no idea. Like, if you see my life too, how different it is from last year, and how the world I'm looking at and the context I find myself in, or how different that is, and how quickly it happened. And on the other hand, if I want to respond different, let's say to my partner or my housemates, how much I need to pay attention not to go the pathway that was there since probably when I was 3 years old or something. Like, how much attention I need to pay when I've slipped in. Like, how do I come back? How do I come back to where I can really make a choice instead of going that route? And that has to do with everything in life. Like, where do I buy stuff? Or do I buy it at all? Or do I choose, what system do I choose to support? By, oh, let's buy online. Okay. And then I support so much maybe consequences I don't want. And yeah, there's so much unknowns that I hadn't seen before, that are more, I would say, more in front of me these days than it used to be. Like, I probably was so naive, and probably lots of my age, like, because when I was born, it was still, things were going better and better every year, and you had more and more income, and and you could see over the generations, people got better. And yeah, and it's probably from my age. Maybe people who have, my children won't say the same thing, I guess. I think that's it for now.
I have an urge following that up to kind of name at least the elements I would like to be there in 20 years. And it really speaks to that question you brought up, Miriam, of like, what is most dysfunctional out there, and how can I attend to that in me, and then after in me, you know, in my family, and then after my family, in my community. And some elements that I find in my personal experience that are helping, that I've come to just realize in my last session with my somatics teacher, who's also my therapist, of how healing it is to actually slow down, and how essential it is that we slow down to be able to do that move of realizing how we jump into our automatic reactions or automatic assumptions that have been embedded in us, that we've been imprinted with from family, from culture. So that's the one element, the slowing down, the taking pauses to be able to work at that level. The second element is just the awareness itself of just dedication to living, being that way, with that level of awareness and cultivation of discernment. And then thirdly, through all that, relationality, like increased relationality. Yeah, I just got these from my, you know, personal session that I'm like, oh, these are the 3 things we did, and it made me feel better, you know. Not just feel better, but also come back to myself, ground, and be able to engage with my prefrontal cortex so that I can make better decisions going into the next moment. And they, you know, you can extend the next moment all the way to 20 years.
I love that, Ece. Thank you for sharing that. Just before you were about to speak, I was going to say something, and then in a way it was so perfect how it landed in your actual experience. Because what was alive for me there was when we consider future, better future, worse future, we're often thinking about a what, like what's that going to look like, and what was kind of resonating for me, sort of following the thread of the conversation, was much more the how. Like if we look at how we are going to show up, how we are going to make choices, how we're going to be in relationship, in a way, then we can borrow from a preferred future and bring it right into the present and actually be in that much more co-creative weaving with a potential. So in your example, I feel like was holding a lot of that, is like how then it's not like a future that we need to just be either passive recipients of or wait for, or even think that we can just make happen, because you can go the other way too. But the responsibility then lies within each of us right now, like it, you know, in a way the future becomes very immediate. And I think that for me then fills me with a more embodied hope rather than a kind of a cognitive one, because then it actually really matters. Like then it matters how I show up every single day, in every single relationship. And without that becoming another huge burden, it can, you know, it could just be a wonderful invitation to step into a preferred future in the hows that I choose moment by moment. And yeah, it feels more active, it feels less passive. So the question of what signs do we see that are potentially hopeful or moving towards a preferred future, one that came to mind was really around that how, and it was that what we used to see as just normal, we now have such a deeper understanding of what traumatized behavior is. And I was just thinking about that this week working with clients. I was like, that is a beautiful revelation that we as a collective are experiencing, that what used to just be literally normal human behavior is deeply traumatized human behavior, both individually and collectively. And by seeing and understanding that, and I think this is really happening, in a big way. It's not just here and there. I really think our understanding of trauma and how it expresses itself is growing in our collective consciousness and awareness and practice. So I see a lot of good signs and hopes there, because I think, oh gosh, I'm reminded of the very first little conversation, high-pitched conversation we had, where I think, Bonnitta, you were saying, how would we like conversations to be maybe different? And we were talking about, while it is important and beautiful to have conversations that are like signposts, they're just pointing to a preferred future, there's something so much more, for me anyways, relevant when we're embodying every little bit of that signpost that we can right now between each other.
It reminds me of one time, a long time ago, my sister came over with her 2 children, and they were really very young. I'm going to say 3 and 5, maybe 2 and 4. And we went to the town land trust, and I wanted to climb this quite steep hill. And looking back, I realized it was a big ask, because they have nubby little legs and it's very steep. And so they started to fuss and have little tantrums. And I said, don't look up, don't look back. And we just were like, let's take one really, really good step and another really, really good step. And then no, don't look back, don't look up. And then we got to the top, and they felt so proud. Like, okay, now look back. And they were so proud that they had walked this thing, and yeah. And I think that's some of the feeling of what you're saying. Like, what can I bring? What can I bring to this moment? Can I bring the flavor of the future I want to live in to this moment? Yeah. And then when we get to the top of the mountain, we'll see, yeah.
And really, Bonnie, it is that tone, it's that flavor, the texture, the rhythm, the feeling, because that's the thing that's going to actually carry the waves of resonance into the alchemy that we live in of relationships. So that's, I think, the big piece for me is just how do we kind of shift the alchemy of the relationships? Because then they can do different things. They go different places if it feels different. Yeah. The future's always right here.
We have want to bring in some of these, they're not really questions, but participation from some of this chat. It's, I watch a lot of Stoas, and people complain it's really hard to be present and do the chat at the same time. So I'm noticing that also. But Happy Ron Hill, Ron had something he wanted to share with us from quite a while ago.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. Well, I was following up on what Nora was. I think what's really exciting to me is the power we now have to unearth the assumptions we have about our relationships, and actually, in partnership, create whatever relationship we want, because there are no rules. Before the love of my life died, we had really defined almost exactly what our relationship was going to be. And there was this incredible intensity because we both felt safe. There was no uncertainty what was going to happen, but who was in charge of what and all this stuff. We kind of defined that. And I think that's, and I don't think that existed 50 years ago because the relationships were so defined in these kind of narrow corridors. Also, as far as in general, I think we really have to have a vision. Each as individuals have to have a positive vision for the future. Otherwise, it's simply never going to happen. And every time we give into despair and our broken hearts, then we end up contributing to the breakdown and not contributing to forward movement. So I think the future is people using technology to find common ground and the needs that we all have and going forward with that. So that's about all I have to say. Thank you much.
If you want to comment or share a reflection, just put it in the chat, or any follow-ups from I don't know, our panelists. What do I call us? From the high pitchers? Like, who are you? Who are you people?
I don't know. But yeah, what I do or try to do with my work is what you name drawn, that safety that you have or that you can build in a relationship. And if we want to shift the pattern of relationship, as Nora was naming it, I think we need to bring that kind of safety, openness, some vulnerability into the conversations we also have somewhere else. I mean, let's say project teams or groups of people working together. And I know it's a big ask and it's a big jump, and it's confusing because are we friends? Are we just project, how we say, colleagues in a project? And we're not family, and still we want to be respectful. And I see a whole area of where we will need to make finer and finer distinctions, but to actually be able to have that, I would say, better relationships, and where we can heal some of the trauma, not because a project team is a trauma group or is a therapy group, but somehow there needs to be some capacity transferred into our project teams, conversations with colleagues, that it doesn't just stay, let's say, in the therapy room. Or how do we bring the essence into daily conversations and bring frustrations in a way not to attack a person, but as some maybe also glimpses of the future that somebody sees or feels or sense. Or I think there's a whole domain to be uncovered, discovered, and made more available to more people. Yeah, that's my response.
I do want to maybe call on Nick, who was asking a question about a collective presencing practice and what kind of difference that would make in the world. You want to come on, Nick?
Yes, thank you. Yes. Yeah, my question was like this, just because I've been practicing collective presencing a little bit recently, the last few months, It's like, imagine an experiment, a real project where, let's say, 1 million people were doing collective presencing simultaneously, in small groups all over the world for, let's say, 6 months to a year. And we're trying to connect with the field of possibility or the field of the future, or however you call that, with either one question or a similar questions about, and trying to like get wisdom from the field. Do you think that would help? Like a project that actually talks to the field of the future in a cohesive way like that on a macro scale and gets actual answers that somebody could actually do something with. I was saying in another part of the chat, like, I want to hear from like the designer of forests and rivers and planets. I want to hear from that voice about what they think we should do next. That was my question, really.
I like your question a lot, Nick. I appreciate you bringing it in. As I was hearing you, I felt you, in a way, giving a voice to the voice of the future, like that the future has a voice, and that it can actually be in addition to when Bonnitta said there is a future, instead of just one kind of predicted future, I was seeing like there's many potential futures, and that can be both overwhelming, confusing, disorienting, and it can also be hope giving and emboldening, encouraging, can be many things. So there's something about our relationship as humanity with the future, and the future actually having a voice, maybe even having will, having choice, having agency, that feels very relevant at the time we're living right now. And so, to tie it back into the how do we get to, anytime we have a glimpse or a dream or a vision or an inspiration or some sense of that preferred future as it shows up in our very midst in the present time, there's something about the how that feels so important. And when I imagine what you were saying, like people coming together to just be present to and maybe glean insight from the future, from that field, it feels like, well, there could be some incredible insight that could come through that. But in order to do that, we need to come together in a particular way to actually even allow that to happen. And so there's something there about what it actually even does to us in the doing of what you're suggesting, I think would actually contribute to a preferred future. Because I think to really do that, it would include a slowing down. It would include a suspending of what we clutch onto so firmly as our beliefs and our opinions and our truths. It would include an interior awareness of when we're dysregulated and when we're regulated, and how we actually show up. Because if we want to play music together, we need to make sure our instruments are tuned. So we need to be aware of when we get triggered and when not. We would need to be very attentive to listening to what's amongst us and between us, rather than just inside each of us. To be willing to listen and be so curious about that whispering of the future. And in a way, then that would allow us to move away from what Nora said is so pernicious in us, is what can I get from it? It's like, what can I contribute? And when is it the moment for me to contribute? And when is it the moment for me to sit back and just listen? So I feel like in your question, there was also a swirl of so many hows that would actually house, now House, some of that future in the now.
Just also to add to that, thank you, to add, this thing about agency and future seems so clear to me that we've operated, like we are agents, and as agents, we are creating the future is the paradigm, versus a flip, we become agents of what the future wants. And it's just, that's such an, I don't even know what I'm saying right now, because I don't know what it would mean to be that, but I can see that reversal has power in some way. Thank you.
So now I'm going to flip the conversation a little. And again, I love when you use the word will, Miriam. I mean, something is very powerful. It's the opposite of a trigger, whatever that is, you know. So this notion of the future evolves from our collective will. And so what I want to do, so I did come up with 4 things, and I'll reframe it. And then I want us to just kind of populate, you know, kind of play with populating it. And maybe the reframe is, now that I'm thinking about it, is even if we assume there's this background trajectory, we don't want to be naive, the AI is going to play a big part of it, and we're scared. Even if we assume that, I think we can also assume that in the next 20 years, there'll be some things that exist that have their seeds today and that never existed before, and we think they're cool. Okay, so maybe that's an easier way to answer that. So in that reframe, for me, the 4 things I have is, I think they're in the future. I think the high school experience for some kids, but not all, is going to be completely reinvented. Probably there'll be international scale classrooms, a lot more peer-to-peer learning, and project-based, big project-based types of assignments that lead into career paths. I think this is already happening, and I think that that will be something that is much more realized in the next 20 years. And that makes me excited. I can give a couple of examples of some seed projects, but I think it has a lot of traction, and I think COVID makes it happen. And the other thing is, I think the will of children is got a lot of momentum, because COVID just made the whole fallacy of how stupid high school is. It's just the worst thing for kids, right? And Greta Thunberg, she showed you could just leave school and travel the world and talk. So there's something in the will that I think has enough momentum to add this to the future. I also think there's something, again, I'm looking for, like, where is there enough will, not just despair, that can make it into add something new to the future. So I think there's something very interesting going around the food and farm movement. And I think it's tied into universal basic income. I think once universal basic income comes, there will be a food to farm citizen currency. They'll see that the government can give you money, instead of having like these food banks and people have to drive to these huge like food, you know. I think that has a lot of momentum, and I think it's consistent with the way young kids look at solving problems. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of activity there. I think the third thing is more of a consciousness. I think that in the next 20 years, it will be normal for educated people to think that mental, spiritual, and ecological and physical well-being are the same thing. I think that will be normative to educated people, whatever educated people means. Like not Trump's children or something. I don't know what that means, but so I think it'll be normative that people will see that physical, mental, spiritual, and ecological health is the same domain. And the last thing I see in the future, and because I think it has a lot of momentum, are what I call outpost communities. So people doing these experiments of co-housing, co-working, maker kind of communities. I don't think that's going to peter out soon. I think it's just getting started. So I see those things existing in the next 20 years, not at scale, they're not scale type experiments, but more quantities, more of them happening than currently. So just want to start it off with that and see if I could harvest some of your ideas also.
I think that if all goes well, I think because I think we have to do this, and I do see a lot of people getting to the end of the road of trying to do it on their own. So I actually think we will be evolving our capacity to collaborate, and I think it's absolutely essential that we do it. So as you were talking about the the collective efforts that happen, maybe not at huge scale, but I see that, but I also feel that I'm very hopeful that they will also be collaborating. So maybe it's not one big thing, but in a way there's a web that starts happening because of the both collective and individual literally coming to the end of, like, I'd say probably everyone in this call has spent a lot of their life trying to make a difference and really trying to show up in the best way they can, and realizing you can do it all, and it's not really necessarily tipping things in the direction that you really wish the future would tip to. And so that need to be the one who runs the project, or the one who is on the podcast, or the one, like, whether that's as a group or as an individual, I literally feel if we keep facing reality, we're coming to the end of that. And my hope is that that will make us really get, we have to do this together. Otherwise, we're actually not going to have a future. So I'm kind of putting that both as a hope and as a sign that I see it is happening.
Yeah, the will that comes from having no more choice. There's no more wiggle room. Roy Bhaskar called it TINA, the TINA principle. There is no alternative. And yeah, that's sometimes how what it takes to make us learn.
I see another one hugely in my work with parents. I really think that kids are getting raised differently. The reality of seeing them as human beings and not as just kids, and not as, in a very subtle way, objectifying them, but actually meeting them as subjects, is gaining ground. And so, on the topic of will and empowerment and making a difference, I think there are more and more children being raised with an intrinsic trust that they can actually make a difference, as much as the future might seem overwhelming and bleak, and the complexity, just getting more and more complex. Yeah, I think that's a very hopeful sign. I see it in the teenagers. They're there. They're actually there as whole people while still becoming.
I think another thing that I see happening is that people start to learn how to be in networks, how to form networks that are actually doing good stuff. Can be in all kinds of topics. So it's not on one topic or the other, but how to actually create momentum and getting things done, even in networks, which no hierarchy or yeah, it's on that theme of collaboration. Like what you said, Miriam, we come to the end of, oh, we can't do it alone, or we need this relationship with all these other domains, and we need to network more and collaborate more. And lots of people getting knowledge and competence in that, and also even wider people kind of breaking their heads, like how can we even do more? And so that's also happening, from tech communities to permaculturists to all kinds of networks.
If I may summarize what I'm hearing, that strongly lives in me, how I summarize it, is that these islands of resilience and sanity that are independent of each other, that are bioregional, and yet they're interconnected. So, you know, the interconnection, the resilience, the sanity, and all the elements from how do we educate our kids and how do we work with each other to how do we feed ourselves and what kind of air we breathe. A lot of innovation and all of that is what's coming, as I understand, as I'm living it. I witness it here.
And even I want to bring in an example from what I know is one example that I know of in like within the European Commission, because there's legislation that comes up around circular economy, and then all the big players are like, oh, we're getting new laws, and there was a project to bring high-level industry on European level together around circular economy. And instead of waiting until the law was coming in, due to how they were hosted and how they were actually participating and collaborating with each other, they came up with a manifesto, like they would sign deliberately, or how do you say that? Like by choice, so not by law, but that they would sit together and actually rethink like how packaging is done, or how could that become circular, or all that. It's from a totally different area, but, and I'm not saying there are tons of these examples, but it's one that I know of, that these, let's say, a CEO of something like Coca-Cola Europe kind of by choice put his energy to do that. So that's also things that are happening.
There is a lot going on around climate change adaptation. And it ties in a bit with what you were saying, Bonnitta. Is like sometimes we seem to wait for the 11th hour, but there are in every field people who have not been waiting for the 11th hour. So the interesting thing that I'm seeing, especially through the work of my husband around forestry and climate change adaptation, is because he's one of the people who was not waiting for the 11th hour, but has been working at this and figuring it out for a few decades. That is now getting met by a readiness in the mainstream, which is I find very interesting. It's like the work of the visionaries, especially if it's actually practical on the ground, it makes a real difference. There's evidence. Now the 11th hour is coming. I mean, you know, if you just think of wildfires, you don't need to convince people that something has to be done. And so there's perhaps I'm just realizing this as I'm speaking, but there's perhaps a real hopeful coming together now of those who've been trying to listen to the future a long time ago and actually do real work in that area, with now others who are going, oh yeah, now I get it. And then suddenly a lot can happen, you know, in our case, at a bioregional, but also provincial level, which could not have happened 10 years ago.
JJ, did you want to share your thought here?
Yeah, so just around, we talked about trauma earlier and how we're getting a much better understanding of that, developmental PTSD, how that's affecting all kinds of behavior. And yeah, an interest of mine in particular is around neurodivergence. I am myself. And yeah, one of the things I'm realizing is neurodivergent people also seem to be a lot more susceptible to like developmental PTSD. But then if you are able to create an environment that's sensitive to those sensitivities, you're also able to bring out more of those gifts and more of those different ways of seeing. And if you're then able to weave those in with each other, we get a much deeper, multidimensional sort of picture of reality and the relationships between those things. And yeah, it seems to be feeding into a lot of kind of what's emerging in these sort of sense-making spaces as well. When I meet other neurodivergent people who haven't even heard about these things, like they kind of tune into them kind of a lot more. I don't know. There's some kind of resonance happening there, and yeah, I'm just interested to see what's going to be happening as we're able to hold those things and bring them together, and as people are able to understand themselves better in those relationships.
If I can follow that up with kind of a semi-question and an observation from my experience that I see is I feel like we're trying to find a new way of talking about spirituality and integrating that into our lives. I'm reading a book called The Spiritual Child that has actual research that shows how much integrating a sense of a greater intelligence running in a child into a child's way of seeing the world actually takes care of those sensitivities and from the get-go allows us to be more resilient. And I personally know the role of spirituality that it plays in my life, in my own healing. So it's the question part of this is, it's interesting to me how we speak around, it feels like a lot of the time of this higher intelligence and not very much directly in these calls, or a lot on the Stoa maybe. So this is, I'm holding it. Is there an elephant in the room about not talking about spirituality more directly, or is it a need to find other ways to talk about it? I'm curious.
Thinking that's our topic for the last session. Maybe you could send us the statement of the topic.
That sounds awesome. JJ, I just wanted to maybe follow up with an observation from what you had shared. There's a few people in my vicinity that are neurodiverse. In some ways we all are, but that have a heightened sensitivity to dissonance and a much quicker degree of suffering and shutdown when there is incoherence. And it's been so beautiful for me to actually see the gift in that and realize that it's almost like a strong evolutionary squeeze towards a sane future, because they cannot function very well in an insane reality. And so rather than seeing that as a problem or a difference that could be dysfunctional, to actually see it as an invitation to greater functionality for all of us has been and is a real eye-opener for me. And yeah, I was hearing that sort of in some of what you were sharing, so I wanted to say thank you.
Yeah, it's almost like kind of sensing organs of a larger organism. Even people who haven't like got the theory around this stuff, they're sensing something in this direction, and yeah, it's just something that makes sense.
Any last reflections?
Maybe I'll just share something at the end. I feel like I've spoken a lot, so I hope it's okay. But while it can feel incredibly complex and overwhelming to imagine a preferred future, I sometimes find it very simple if you put yourself behind the eyes of a child and you consider what kind of life and life conditions and relationships are necessary for a little person to thrive and grow and not have to compromise their intrinsic wholeness as they are becoming. So how can the human being stay intact while the human is becoming? And I feel if we put that lens on, in a way it is looking at, you know, those who are maybe most vulnerable in our society. How can life work for those who are most vulnerable? So that actually includes neurodiverse too, and it includes many people. I think it's a lens that can also bring some simplicity beyond complexity. It doesn't have to be so complicated. The complexity can actually land quite succinctly in what makes sense for a little person to be growing up in this world and thrive and flourishing.
Might I share something here about the children? In our community, we have a process that we use, and it involves healing the past and bringing it into the present, and dealing with the future and bringing it into the present. And it does, I put a post, it does deal with a spiritual aspect. It can be God, it can be spirit, it can be essence, it can be consciousness, whatever anyone calls it. I often call it the something more. And the system that we use in our community, I've tried with my grandchildren when they were very young. And it gave them a feeling of control over parts of their personality that were not working well in community with other children. I think of one my grandson called Tantrum Tom. And by bringing in the element of God, because they're a religious family, that God part in him was able to talk to Tom when he started to get all worked up. And slowly Tom got to see that my grandson from this place would handle things and that he didn't have to do it. And that's the kind of process we're working in our community. We have been meeting in presence for at least 35 years together, practicing being in the present moment, but also bringing in a sense of the spiritual, the something more that extends to infinity, that gives us an ongoing development of a new systems theory. And out of that new systems theory come things in the present moment that we didn't have to look into the future. The future becomes the present. And that edge of spirituality is what brings the future into the now moment, that sensing of still honoring something evolutionary, something in the future, but it becomes right in the present moment. And over the years, we've watched people change radically and become who they personally, individually, and uniquely are in the midst of this oneness and connection. And mine is a very different expression than my daughter at this point. My daughter is on a team that is working in this way and bringing it into the US Congress. So a lot of these things can unfold, but what the beauty we saw is that every person begins to be more deeply defined uniquely. At the same time, they're expanding out into the something more, where the future becomes the present. New ideas just arrive out of nowhere. New healings to a wounded past. That crust starts to fall away with the tenderness of this place. So I really like bringing in the spiritual aspect, the something more aspect of unfolding, healing the past and bringing the future into the present moment by moment.
So I think for me, what stands out in this is, again, this is something that is starting to manifest, is starting to come into our future. And that is, so, you know, a lot of this work traditionally we do with older adults who are trying to recover childhood trauma or childhood learning events. And what we're learning is that the access point, that children are doing this work, they are asking these metacognitive questions, they are, as Alison Gopnik says, the child is a scientist about the world. He just needs to support different theories. And so if we work there, then we're not dealing with trauma. We're dealing with transformational potential of the core self of the child as they navigate that. And, you know, so a lot of this turns that into, it's because we haven't supported it or looked at it or fed it or nourished it that it becomes stilted and atrophied and then becomes, you know, trauma in the adult later on. So I think this is definitely something that's new and powerful. And yeah, I think it's still very latent, but it certainly has momentum. Yeah, so maybe we can end on that, because that's very exciting and very, you know, we found something that is a next step and toward a positive future. So thank you for that. And Peter, are you going to come on, or should I just, you can just DM me here if I should just wrap it up?
Yeah, you can wrap it up, B.
Okay, so thank you so much for being here. Your presence on the Stoa with us today is already a gift, but if you feel like you would like to contribute more, you can do that on the Patreon page. I want to especially thank Ece and Ria and Miriam and Nora and Sky with her spirit that is here, even though carnally or digitally, her pixels were not on the screen. And I very much look forward to the last session next week. It's at 11 o'clock. I just put that on your calendar. Yeah, and just take this cue from Ece and let's make it some kind of topic on spirituality. Thank you so much. Have a great day.